Thanks for joining this, the first Editors Club get-together for some time. It's fair to say that all of us at Prospect are particularly grateful to our most loyal readers in this year, because like so many other organisations, we've had a bit of a bumpy time of it. Adverts and events have not been possible to organise in the way that they ordinarily would have been with the COVID lockdown. And so more than ever, we're dependent on and grateful for our extremely loyal and long-term readers, which all of you on the call are. So I'd like to start, as well as saying, I hope you're going to have a happy Christmas, and I hope we're all going to have a happier 2021, by saying a heartfelt thank you. In terms of what we're going to cover today and who we've got on the call, I'm pleased to be joined by our managing editor and book supremo, Samira Rahim, and also Samira Shackle, who some of you will have seen in the pages of Prospect before, but has this time joined us in a slightly different role as an assistant editor, who's come along and actually got our hands dirty on some of the other pieces and commissioned some of the pieces for the magazine that you'll be receiving in the coming days. And in fact, I think you've already got a PDF of. So it's me, Tom, and Samira. We thought, seeing as we haven't been together as a group for a while, we'd split it into two discussions. First of all, some just reflections on the year, and where we stand after a year of COVID, and looking forward now with the vaccine to a world after COVID, and whether we'll go back to where we came from or not. And secondly, how Prospect is going to be navigating that changing world. So we'll deliberately split it from the outside world to the much smaller world of Prospect as two halves of the discussion. We'll do about 20 minutes on each. Do get involved and send questions in. Our colleague, senior editor Alex Dean, is having a good look at the chat and the Q&A function. So if any of you want to ask questions, there's no problem with that at all. Just put them on that chat. He'll keep an eye on it. I know some of you have already emailed in with questions, and Alex has had a good look through those and will throw them at the rest of us. And we'll do that at 2 points. Once after we've finished the State of the World discussion, and then once again after we've done the State of Prospect type of discussion. Okay, so that's how I think we'll organise things. 2 lots of 20 minutes, and we'll aim to wrap up at 11:45 sharp. So without further ado, here we are. Samir first, at the end of 2020, and it's a year like none other we've ever lived for. But now that we can see the end in sight with the vaccine, do you think everything's changed or nothing's changed?
I think a massive amount has changed just with the vaccine. I mean, it's only a few months ago that we were thinking, will we even get a vaccine at all? And I was just looking up. I was remembering in the office we were chatting about the first person in the UK to get the virus. Do you remember that guy, the super spreader? He was in Singapore and then he came to Britain. I think that was in February. And to go from first person in the UK to get it to rolling out the vaccine from February to December is absolutely amazing, really. When we ran, I remember there was a weekend when we realised that this was going to be an absolutely enormous story, and when we're going to have to clear most of the other stories out of the magazine and just focus on this. I think it was the April issue. Phil Ball did a really interesting piece about, how's the vaccine going to work? How we can do it. And he is somebody with definite faith in the power of science to solve problems. But he was not predicting December. He was
18 months.
He said it would take 18 months. And in fact, he does an update in this issue telling us why exactly it's managed to go so fast. And I think, lots of money, being able to do things concurrently rather than sequentially, not having to wait. And I think the enormous, frankly, economic incentive of being the person who gets the vaccine out, there'll probably be a Nobel Prize alongside it. So I think in a way we've had some really dark times, but we have to sort of step back and all the logistical issues with the vaccine and lockdowns and tears. We're still in that frustrating world, but we know we have a vaccine that seems to work. And so therefore, there's no reason why we can't go back to normal at some point next year.
And Samira, when we talk about going to normal, back to normal, I mean, do we want to? Is that likely when you look at politics, economics, international relations, whatever you choose? Do you think we're going back to normal come next summer when we've all had this vaccine?
It's hard to say, really. I mean, I'd hope so. I think my sort of least favourite opinion pieces to read have been the ones that say life as we know it is never going to return. So I've been kind of studiously avoiding that strand of opinion personally. But yeah, I think that we have good reason, it seems, to expect at least at some point in 2021 we'll be returning to normality. I wonder whether it might take a while to get the critical number of the population vaccinated, might take some time. Everything kind of seems, apart from the vaccine itself, everything seems to have been slower than expected, you know, so maybe, maybe it's the second half of next year rather than by the summer. I do think also that you mentioned international relations. It's worth thinking about the fact that we are the first country to be rolling this out. I know there's been quite a lot of discussion in the last few days about the fact that such a big proportion of the vaccines have been bought up by richer countries. And I wonder whether we're really going to start to see that disparity globally over the coming year, because you'll have developed countries like the UK, like the US, like the countries of the European Union, steadily getting more and more of their populations vaccinated, and vast swathes of the developing world unable to access the same. So perhaps we'll see different kinds of travel restrictions. I wonder, I think that's going to be quite hard to avoid that global disparity.
But there are some habits, aren't there? I mean, we'll come on to politics, hard politics and economics, if you like, later. But there's just, in terms of the way we live, the way we do things, where people maybe have got used to doing things slightly differently. You know, I mean, I, for example, realised I was working out of a bedroom in London and took the chance to move to Yorkshire, which I wouldn't have probably done this year otherwise, because we worked out that we can all work remotely. We had a lovely piece by Hepzibah Anderson, Samir, didn't we, talking about how the office, this institution that we used to love and hate at the same time, but people who are heavily invested in London office property are very nervous, aren't they? That maybe we're not going to go back.
Yes, and it's been a strange year. I'm one of those weird people who actually really likes offices, and I like the office environment. I like it so much that, I mean, today I'm at home, but usually 4 days a week I'm actually in the office, often the only person in there. And I you know, it's because it's easier for me to to get transport there. I can just bike in, and it's not hard for me. I think we've all had to get used to communicating in an oddly more formal way. When we do things like this and we have meetings like this, we have to sort of it's more difficult to bounce off ideas in a way, and things have sort of weirdly been less easy, I think. I personally think that when everyone is sort of around and everyone is chatting, a lot of different kind of ideas can bubble up then in interesting ways. But at the same time, it's still putting together the magazine, it's still communicating with people, and I don't suppose Fridays will ever be the same again. You know, people will change their working patterns quite considerably, and that extra flexibility is definitely has been useful, I think.
But okay, so let's turn to, as it were, affairs of land and sea, Samira. I mean, politics. It doesn't feel like it's been as convulsive as, say, the global financial crisis. I mean, Boris Johnson's still there. He's still on about 40% in the opinion polls. Donald Trump lost, but he still got 70 million votes, which is more than last time. Angela Merkel is due to retire this year, but looks like she's very much choosing her own timetable. It doesn't feel like it did a year or two after Lehman Brothers fell, when every government that was up for re-election was tumbling.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess there's something, it feels like quite uncharted territory, doesn't it? And it's, you know, we saw that with the US election, but it was just very, very difficult to predict how it was going to impact how it was going to impact the election at all. And yeah, I do wonder in terms of our own political landscape how things will look, once we're through the kind of the sort of crux of the crisis, I suppose, and we start to maybe have a bit of time and space to examine a bit more. Because I think there seems to be a bit of an attitude that's they're not doing a great job, but I know the current government's ranked pretty low on performance in the crisis, but there's also a sense that, would anyone really have done a great job in this setting? So I do wonder how it's all going to pan out as more and more people are vaccinated and as some semblance of normality begins to return. Maybe that's when we'll see some kind of reckoning.
Samir, what do you think, if we think about international relations? It started in China, it more or less finished in China a damn sight sooner than it did over here. I mean, these kind of crises, one thing we know they can do is accelerate a trend that's already going on, whether it's like reorientating geopolitics in that way, or people shopping at Amazon instead of the high street. That's often how they have lasting effects, isn't it? By kind of accelerating something that was already in the works.
Yeah, it's interesting. You were talking about comparing it with the financial crisis, and I've just been reading Barack Obama's memoir, which is reviewed in the current issue. And I'm just reading the chapter about him saving the economy and Tim Geithner and all the negotiations. And one of the regrets that Obama says he has is that he wanted to return things back to, as it were, normal. And that meant actually bailing out the banks and getting them on side in some way. And he now regrets somewhat that he didn't take the opportunity to be more radical and to change things in a bolder way. Things are different here because it's almost as if Johnson and Sunak wanted, they didn't want to expand the welfare state enormously and furlough people and change the economy to a much more sort of welfare-oriented society, but they have been forced to. And as we know, the classic example is income taxes. Temporary measures often turn out to be permanent. And once you give people certain benefits, it's very hard to take them away. And we've got quite an interesting piece by Martin Sandbu in this issue, talking about just as we're leaving the European Union and supposedly orientating to a more sort of liberal free market model, coronavirus has forced us to adopt a more European style welfare model. So I think that when we have this moment of national unity, when we have the sort of clapping for carers, when we have all that stuff, it's going to be very difficult to cut back some of the things that people are relying on. So the role of the state, in a situation like this, the state has taken on enormous powers, both economically, but also in terms of interference in people's lives. The idea that a year ago people would say, a government regulation could tell you to not leave your house, or even, mandate how close you walk to other people, or whether you could stay over at your girlfriend's house, or things like that. It's quite extraordinary. It does show ultimately that the state is the thing that we fundamentally all rely on, and perhaps it's creaked in many ways and not been as smooth as we would have liked. But in general, I think that it has stood up quite well, particularly with the economic stuff. We'll see, I guess, is one thing I'd say, because we go out of this now with both the state more enmeshed in the economy than it's been for a very long time. The furlough scheme in particular, paying people's wages is not something the British state's done like that before, but also just the level of debt. And this government, if we think of it as one government from 2010, its animating purpose was to reduce the stock of national debt from, I think, about 80% of GDP or something in 2010. Well, now it's going to be over 100% this year, and the management of that is going to be a huge issue going forward. And even small things like, small if you're in the lucky position to be financially secure, the increase in universal credit of £20 a week that was done for this emergency period
It's due to be cut in April. And I think that's coming up very soon. Whether the government can get away with that, reducing the universal credit back down or not, is going to be quite an early test in the new year of whether we can get back to normal, because it's going to be extremely hard for people who've been, facing squeezes and freezes for a long time to suddenly see their income cut by £20 as unemployment rises. On the other hand, if the government doesn't do that, it's effectively saying we're in for a bigger state for the long term, which then gets the issues onto tax and all the difficulties there. I mean, anything else, Samira, you think in terms of themes we should be looking for going out of this crisis? We've talked now about science, about economy, and politics. Anything else maybe culturally or in terms of how countries are cooperating that you'd urge us to keep an eye on in 2021?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. I think the first thing that springs to mind culturally, and perhaps Samira might have views on this too, is the kind of devastating impact we've seen on the arts, certainly in this country. The kind of theatre and music and so many things, and galleries so devastatingly affected, and it will be interesting to see what survives and what doesn't, because I think that could really radically reshape our kind of cultural landscape. I know we already saw some local regional theatres around the UK closing during the crisis earlier this year. So I think that could have a really profound impact. And I know that, on a more optimistic note, many theatres have embraced doing, sort of this kind of thing, Zoom, and so on. But I think that, we might see the impact of that for a long time to come.
We've got James Graham writing about exactly that, and he's kind of optimistic. He's a sort of optimistic type of guy, as well as a playwright in the magazine, right at the front of the new one. So,
yeah, he had some great suggestions, didn't he?
Yeah, about how theatres can emerge from this more as a community hub than they used to be. Samir, before we bring in the questions, any last word on the kind of cultural consequences that you can see enduring? I should say to any readers who don't know that Samir also was a judge for the Booker Prize this year. So I guess the novel is probably one aspect of culture that's probably had quite a good crisis, in that people can get on and read when they've got nothing else to do.
Absolutely. And actually, books are booming. I mean, publishing is doing really, really well. I was talking to a publisher the other day, and she was saying, sort of slightly embarrassedly, that, we should probably return some of our furlough money, like the supermarkets, because we've done so well this year. Even local bookshops, which obviously have had to shut and are struggling, they're not doing as badly as we thought. There've been new innovations. There's a new website called bookshop.org, which apparently is going to be helping independent retailers a bit more, although there's been some debate about that. So books, I think, are in a pretty healthy state. As far as the Booker was concerned, having a lot more time on your hands to sit down and read the 162 books was probably a boon for me, and certainly for the other judges who were all of us in lockdown doing these discussions over Zoom. It did make things a bit easier. I mean, my great fear is it's not that, the National Theatre will close, or even regional theatres, which are state supported. It's more like your 17 or 18-year-old person who wants to be a musician or a dancer or an actor or some kind of performer, and then start, will they take the risk to do the training that is going to be expensive? And there's, just everything cascades down. It's the sort of long-term effect of people being unable to take the risks necessary to create works of art or do performances. That is my real worry. Writing, funnily enough, is one of those things that is one of the least, you can sit at home and do it on your computer. It doesn't require other people just to get it done. It doesn't require that, as it were, training, or if you can be trained in a university setting, you can do it over Zoom quite easily. But it's the performing arts and people's lack of opportunity in them that is the real worry.
Let's just pause there and see what questions people have on the year just been and the year to come, as it were. Alex, is it possible? Sorry, listeners, we have two people called Alex involved in this. One Alex is going to bring the other Alex in. Alex Dean, tell us what questions, if any, we've got in at this point.
Hiya, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So we've been talking a bit about the outside world, but we haven't really talked about Brexit, which is obviously one of the biggest headlines in the news at the moment. And I mean, I've got a question here, literally asking what happens next on Brexit, which I don't know if anyone's ambitious enough to sort of hazard a guess. I mean, Tom, you wrote a piece for the website yesterday where you put your cards on the table, so maybe you'd be the best person to go first.
Sure. I mean, my take on this, I decided to stick my neck out because often with the kind of punditry, there's a temptation to say, oh, you know, it's going to be 50-50 or this election's going to be very close, because then you can't be that wrong. But with Boris Johnson, I just have this feeling that we've seen this show before. You know, like last year, he closed down Parliament, he got his knuckles rapped by the Supreme Court. He kicked a large chunk of his parliamentary party out, depriving himself of what was left of his majority. And it was all kind of, all the signals, all the optics, as people say, was we're going to go for this kamikaze no deal. And I just feel a bit like we're seeing that again. And what you'll remember happened last time in the end is to save the day at the very last minute, he went and spoke to the Irish Prime Minister and said, do you know what? We can put Northern Ireland in a separate arrangement after all. We'll have a border in the Irish Sea, and all that stuff we said about no Prime Minister could ever countenance the you know, a new border within the UK. We'll quietly forget that. And there's so much panic about this no deal that then he'll get away with it. And I suppose that's still my reading of it, is that this is going to happen again. He's going to find a way to describe compromises that he'll make within the next days, or possibly, you know, a week or two, and then he'll fold. Now, I could be wrong. I know some people who look at this, in particular from Europe, say that I'm looking at this through an unduly Westminster prism, and that actually people in Europe don't want to connive in Boris Johnson doing something that looks like a great triumph again, and that, like, literally that sort of impatience might mean that they're not going to do a deal. But I don't know, my money would still be, if it's in everyone's interest for there to be a deal, probably something will turn up. But like I say, I've stuck my neck out, so I'm now vulnerable to being proved wrong. Just before we move on from Brexit, though, one thing we'll certainly have to think about next year, Samir, is once we're through this Brexit business, of course, it's not going to go away because Britain's still going to have to talk to Europe about lots of things. But there will be a question, I think, about Britain's place in the world that we'll need to give some thought to, Samir.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
And after you, there's a confusion of name, isn't there?
Samira, go ahead, Samira.
Yeah, I think that is definitely true, the kind of question of Britain's place in the world. I feel like there's maybe sometimes a slightly inflated sense of that in Britain. You know, we've got the kind of colonial history, and we've got this I think perception of a continued clout that I think might start to dissipate a little bit on the world stage once post-Brexit, when we're no longer the kind of Anglophone part of the EU that provides this kind of English-speaking window into it. Certainly, I mean, I do not this year, obviously, because of the pandemic, but in my normal life, I do quite a lot of reporting around the world. And on various trips, I spent a lot of time in Pakistan, also in the Middle East. I've done work trips in Nigeria, and it comes up quite a lot, actually, Brexit on trips. You know, and there's I think quite a sense of Schadenfreude of, you know, that Britain's sort of willingly shooting itself in the foot is the perception on the ground a lot of the time internationally. And I do think that we might start to see a kind of diminished role globally. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, we've also seen like a change in how Britain wants to have influence in the world. In the spending review, we saw a £4 billion reduction in the international aid budget and a £4 billion increase in the defence budget. So, you know, a move from soft to hard power, if you like. Samir, just like maybe I should put the question the other way around, actually, because of course, all of the time I've been editor, you know, 4 years and a half, we've been living in the shadow of this Brexit vote, and we've covered it probably in more detail than any other magazine, you know, the constitutional convulsions, the economics, all the different angles. But do you think actually we're going to want less of Britain in the world after this, and just get on to talking about, I don't know, global economics and global trends in politics? Do you think that like we might be a bit less parochial, if you like?
We're going to have to be. We're going to have to be, because if the phrase global Britain means anything, it's going to be forging new alliances, getting new trade deals, thinking about things that we haven't thought about for a very long time. And we were always semi-attached to Europe. Personally speaking, I thought that we'd already had quite a good deal by being in Europe, but not in the euro, and just sort of, and so ultimately the deal that you described that will be done means that we will remain pretty close to Europe, but maybe we'll have to learn how to do different things differently. I mean, in terms of what we cover in the magazine, you know, we've rearranged the magazine a little bit according to these 4 categories. Should we chat about those? Yeah,
I'm just keen that we make sure we hear from the readers a tiny bit more, and then we'll come on to the magazine.
Yeah.
Because that's a very nice segue point. We've got Robert McFarland here who's saying, can someone explain to me why accepting an unknown possible commitment in the future means an unacceptable loss of sovereignty, while accepting an obligation not to regress on existing commitments appears to be okay? So in other words, you know, we'll agree not to reverse the European regulations on clean beaches or whatever, and we'll agree not to do that for the rest of time. Whereas you know, if there was an increase in paternity allowance across Europe, Boris Johnson is saying it's an unacceptable red line that we'd have to follow it. Robert, I can only really say on that logically you make a very powerful point, you know, in terms of no parliament will bind its successor, and that was always part of the old idea of parliamentary sovereignty. Not being able to reverse something seems as much of a constraint as being committed to follow something, but politically the difference between acts and omissions seems like to have some resonance. I mean, it's a good philosophical angle you've got there on the exact point, nail on which the coat of these talks appears to be snagged, but beyond saying that seems to be the way the politics plays out, I'm not sure I can answer it as a philosophical riddle, or indeed that anyone could. Alex, one last question on this before we go into Samir's point about the magazine, maybe? Or
yes, well, another big change that we haven't really talked about too much is shopping habits. That's obviously something that's changed enormously during 2020, and we had a question specifically on that and the high street and the demise of the high street, and I know that Hepzibah Anderson wrote an essay for us on that. Basically, this reader's just wondering, will we return to a situation where we go and buy our things physically, or is you know, the boost of Amazon and so on during 2020 here to stay?
Oh, I think, yeah. I mean, this is really a kind of archetypal case of the will this be one where a you know, a panicked change or a forced sudden change because of the pandemic sticks, and it might do because you know, it's giving history a nudge in a direction which it was already going, in terms of people buying their Christmas presents online and all that kind of thing. I mean, what Hepzibah Anderson's piece said is that whereas a generation ago, when we talked about our high streets, we were normally you get a bit whimsical about the idea of independent butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, I don't know, and you know, regret the coming of the kind of chain stores. The thing that's changed in the last decade or two of Amazon is that the chain stores themselves have started to fall, and as ever, people don't realise what they've got till it's gone. And so whereas we used to say, oh, this high street could be anywhere, because we've got a Boots and a Smiths, and go back a few years, a Woolworths. What we're seeing now is that when your local Marks and Spencer's close, or your local Topshop closes, then suddenly it's our M&S and our Topshop, where, like, these stores that a lot of us grew up meeting friends in, and all the rest of it. And I think, Samira, that there's a real problem here in terms of social policy, because if we don't go back to high streets, I can't see independents filling the gaps. So much, there was a cross subsidy. Of course, it was all about trade and retail and commerce, but there was a real cross subsidy that these were meeting places, and it's not obvious what's going to fill the gap. You can't turn the whole of the town centre into a park.
Yeah, and just seeing the number of restaurants that have just been permanently closed, it seems, just around Victoria. Walking around yesterday lunchtime, there used to be 7 or 8 different options for lunch, and now there's about 1 or 2. Pret is the sort of the cockroach of the high street. Even a nuclear bomb will not destroy it. They'll just always keep on, they'll always be there. But Benugo, Leon, Itsu, they're all closed, and those branches are permanently closed, and even longer. And there is something. There is shopping is a social. It's a social event. People do it together. They do it with their families. The serendipity of going into a shop and finding something, trying something on, or flicking through a book. I personally much prefer that to going online the whole time. When it feels like, when you go online to buy something, it's just work, isn't it? You feel like, it's just work, isn't it? More stuff, clicking on a computer and having to put your details into a website and all the rest of it. And of course, there's great things that you can buy online, and deals and things like that. But personally, maybe just because of my generation, I definitely think that, and I also think that, if you're talking about independent bookshops and the books world, which I know a bit better maybe, independent bookshops have closed. Some of them weren't that good, in the 80s and 90s. Some of them weren't as brilliant as we remember them. We have an idealized version of them. And funnily enough, the sort of the Waterstones, Foyles, which has 2 or 3 branches now, even Borders, remember them. Soulless as they were, they did have huge range, and they did stock a large set of things, and they did give you a huge amount of choice. And losing yourself in one of those big bookshops, particularly Foyles for me, has been one of the things I really missed this year.
Samira, you're certainly younger than me, and younger, I think, than Samira as well. Do you think we're being too gloomy or nostalgic in assuming that, like, as high streets empty out, they're just going to be great concrete husks that we need to worry about? Can you think of anything imaginative or interesting that might fill the space?
Yeah, it's difficult to say, really. And I think what you said earlier is very true, that the pandemic's kind of hastened a trend that we were already seeing. Yeah, I think that I would kind of share the idea that it's a bit bleak to think of just kind of completely hollowed out high streets and everything online. But I wonder if maybe certain small independent businesses might flourish. I think it's really fascinating what you're saying, that the kind of conversation that we maybe used to have years ago about independent shops being crowded out by chains is now about chains being crowded out by online retailers. And I wonder if maybe we'll see a return to the kind of local small shops, which maybe don't have the same kind of yields as they may have done previously. But I do think that there's some appetite for the kind of tangible and the local and so on. I guess it's just a question of how profitable that will be.
We need to come on to prospect now, because we've touched on all kinds of social, economic and cultural issues that we're going to talk about. Now, Samir, the new magazine, which I've got here, I believe 1 or 2 of our readers, no, all our readers should have as a PDF copy. Really nice, grabby cover, I think. It's slightly refreshed, isn't it, Samir? First of all, just tell us why it looks different, and then dig into the substance a little bit about what's different about the new prospect.
Well, we wanted to make the magazine a bit easier to read and just refresh it. I think it's important just to change things up a little bit, if only for the sake of the people, for readers. It just means that you feel like there's something slightly new happening. So we've slightly shrunk the prospect masthead, gives it more of a sort of journal-like feel. The most important innovation, I think, is that we've increased the font size and the spacing of the font. This is a sort of an issue I've been thinking about actually quite a lot. I think the prospect should be as easy to read as possible. And I think readers, when they get it in their hands and they flick through it, they will definitely see that there are fewer words on each page. The articles aren't substantially shorter. We've just rearranged images and things like that. But we've definitely made it clearer and cleaner to read. In the upfront section near the beginning, which used to be called opinions, we've got more sort of pithy, shorter pieces at the front, just to sort of get you into it in a sort of smarter way. And then we go on to the sort of the longer essays. But essentially, we're doing the same sort of thing. But in terms of the way the magazine looks, we're trying to make it more reader friendly.
Yeah, and in a way, we're doubling down on the longer form journalism, aren't we? Because for example, the cover story, which maybe we should have a word on, is this by Timothy Garton Ash, The Future of Liberalism. It's getting on for 7,000 words long. That's more than twice. It's twice what a traditional prospect piece would have done. We've made a bit of space, like squeezing down what was called the live section at the back. And as you say, we've made those pieces at the front shorter, but like with the really long pieces, we're running them just as long, and we're giving them more room to breathe on the page, which I think will make them a bit quicker to read, because it could get a bit dense on the page before. But there's absolutely no reduction in the length or the rigor. If anything, it's kind of going a bit upmarket rather than down, I'd say.
Well, that's the role of prospect, isn't it? I mean, we see now that the things that people are most interested in reading are sort of little updates, little bits of information that they can get, a quick sort of everything you need to know about, and then 500 or 600 words, which we've included. But really, to have a big impact is to have a piece like Timothy Garton Ash's on the future of liberalism, takes a big subject, one that's close to our readers' hearts and one that we're interested in here at the magazine, and to have a writer who is able to expound at that length, but also do it with a kind of panache that means it really carries you through. I mean, I really like that piece, actually. I think it's really interesting because it's about liberalism, but it's about how liberalism can improve itself. And it's about self-critical liberalism, not a sort of mindless celebration of it. And one of the things he points out is that the Enlightenment tradition, which Prospect is, thinks of itself as being in, one of the best, if not the most important aspects of it is the ability to critique your own ideas, the ability to step back and say, actually, is the way liberalism has been going and putting itself forward, has that actually contributed in some way to the populism and the nationalism that is still, despite Trump's defeat, pretty popular around the world? So his prescription for what we need to do about it is, it's a fascinating read.
Samira, one thing we've done in the new magazine, readers will see arranged on the contents page, we're slightly curating a bit more proactively than we used to. So we're putting things under themes of liberal democracy or tomorrow's economy or beyond borders for the, like globe straddling problems, as it were, as well as leaving space for serendipity and writerly delights in what we're calling the critical thinking section at the back. You've been involved closely, though, Samira, in 3 or 4 essays in particular in this issue. Is there one you'd like to single out and just say a word about how it came about and what it's about as an illustration of how we're doing this?
Yeah, maybe the piece on the Arab Spring, which is by Layli Faroudi, who's a writer who hasn't written for Prospect before, but who I've worked with elsewhere before. She's a young reporter based in Tunisia. And I think what that piece does quite well is it takes quite a close local focus, and there's lots of colour and detail about Tunisia and the kind of political landscape there. But obviously most readers, I think myself included, wouldn't necessarily know a huge amount about Tunisia, but it kind of uses that to tell us a much bigger story, which is about where we are 10 years on from the Arab Spring. So, you know, we're a decade on from the revolutions that swept across the region, toppling dictators and so on. We've seen war and unimaginable horrors in many different countries, but in Tunisia, which is where it all started, of course, there's a kind of messy move. You know, they're still in, it's messy, but they're still in a democratic system effectively. So she kind of treads that path quite well, I think, and that essay really fits into those kind of big themes about these, you know, where are we after these big democratic shifts?
Exactly. So it's all about behind the headlines. That's under a section called Eternal Vigilance, which I guess, you know, when you think about the Arab Spring, all the hopes of 10 years ago, of 2011, all these new democracies, but one by one they were snuffed out. You have to be vigilant about these things. But then there is still hope, because Tunisia is still a form of democracy. I should bring Alex in for any last questions from the readers specifically on Prospect, and then we will wrap up very soon.
Yes, we did have one that speaks to what you've just been discussing quite tightly, actually, which is whether the fact that we've got these headings on things like liberal democracy means that Prospect's role is changing and it's becoming more campaigny or even party political.
Well, certainly where we talk about liberal democracy, we're talking about the system of government rather than Nick Clegg or the Lib Dems. So we certainly can't be party political. The way we're set up means we can't be party political. We're set up with a trust that means that we can't campaign for a political party, and we wouldn't want to. I think we'll continue to take material from all sides, because that's what's made Prospect interesting for 25 years. It's more, I think, about achieving clarity about why we're doing what we're doing, because you need, and we've carved out space for it, room for fascinating pieces. We've had one of the best pieces we've run since I've been editor was by Cal Flynn, who's in the New magazine, again on, you know, like efforts over the years to help animals to talk, you know, that kind of thing, philosophical, interesting, quirky. We need to make space for, and we've done it now in this new critical thinking section. But of course, that's the sort of the lovely extra that you get with Prospect. I think that the core of it has always been about big picture politics, economics, and international relations and so on. And what we're really doing is just signalling why we're in a crowded media market, focusing on, let's say, another piece Samira worked on, food banks. It's because we think that obviously they're an important issue in themselves, but they also tell you something about what's gone wrong with the UK economy. Likewise, when we talk in this issue about Myanmar and the tragedy there, because our mission is always to take you behind the headlines rather than just report on the latest headline. We use that as an opportunity to get into a wider discussion about all the many times when sadly the UN has failed. So I think it's really about saying we're still going to report on things just because they're interesting, but it's more saying when we seek to widen it out, what's the principle in our mind? While we're saying Prospect readers really need to know about this. Samir, do you want any further last word on that aspect of the headings?
I suppose you can, as a reader, you can take them or leave them, really, because you can flick through the magazine, and we know that people don't necessarily read a magazine from front to back. Sometimes they read it from back to front, or they turn to their favourite writers, or they turn to their favourite sections. But I suppose it's for those who want to take it, and for us as editors commissioning pieces, it just gives a little bit more clarity an organisation to the magazine. I would say that, you know, pieces about liberalism and democracy, how to make a fairer economy, things that are happening in foreign countries which we should know about, and, you know, just things, border straddling issues. These are things that we would have covered anyway. But it just, for the reader, just gives a little bit more guidance. So, for example, if you are mostly interested in, say, the economic coverage of Prospect, you can turn to a section and that will have the stuff about economics and fairer society and all the issues to do with that, broadly conceived, because in the economics piece, we've got both, Lionel Barber, the former FT editor, has done a sort of institutional portrait of the Treasury, which is at the very much, you know, the high end of the sort of, the people in charge and what they're doing and why they're doing it. But we also have something, more from the ground up, a very, very good reported piece that Samira can take credit for, she brought in, about food banks and why the different ways that different organizations have been approaching food banks, whether they're a permanent part of the landscape now or whether the aim should be for them to disappear really and people to be able to have enough money in their pockets to eat. So it's a broadly conceived section which has enough sort of give, as it were, to have lots of different things in it. But hopefully as a reader, it's just be an extra bit of guidance, bit of signposting.
I think that's right. I think, like, you know, there are magazines like The Economist that are very, very tightly curated. So, you know, you've got your home pages, your forum pages and the rest of it. There are other magazines like the London Review of Books or The Atlantic, where you turn the page and you really haven't got a clue what you're going to get next. We're just tilting ourselves very gently, I think, in the direction, not editorially, but just in terms of how much signposting there is of a magazine that's a bit clearer about what's where. But hopefully our loyal readers will find that it's very much the same types of pieces and often the same writers as you've been coming back for a number of years. We are now at time. I'm going to give Alex Dean one last chance to see if there's anything that looks like a burning issue that he's getting in on his emails. If not, we can round things up. Alex?
Yes, there's a few left that I haven't asked, so I'm just trying to pick the most. There are all lots of good stuff here. I suppose probably one that just would make sense to ask is whether there's been any hiccups involved in putting together a magazine from home.
I think that's quite a good note to end on. We did have to email all of you, all readers, all subscribers at one point and confess that we put 2 pages in a long article about the vaccine, one that popped up earlier actually, the wrong way round, which was a serious production error, but luckily one that has not been repeated. Basically we've all got used to it. And in fact, you know, we've got colleagues that we've recruited and have joined and have not yet been to the office, which is a strange state of affairs that none of us would have imagined before 2020. But for the most part, you know, thanks to all these wonderful colleagues, we've got the magazine out. Problems with the Royal Mail are our biggest headache at the moment, people getting the magazine late, but they do tend to get it in the end. We're keeping going with the website at the full pelt and the podcast and all the rest of it. Because of time, I think we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for taking the time to listen in. I should have said at the beginning, we'll record this chat for other members of the club who weren't able to join the call. Do have a close look out though for this new magazine with the Statue of Liberty on the front that you'll be getting as soon as Royal Mail get their act together. We know it's been posted and we know it's on its way. And do, as our most valued readers, please let us know what you like and don't like, because it's always an evolving, living thing, a magazine. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time. Thanks for sticking with Prospect during this complicated year. I hope you and your families have a enjoyable season and also get through the rest of this difficult time in one piece. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll leave it there for now.